Hello. Okay, good. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Because I am ready to say a few words about you,
Okay.
how precious you are to all of us, IATFlers, but also participants of this webinar. So let me start. You know, when I met you, as you remember, I met you at IATF conference in Gdańsk, and then we met at the US consulate in Krakow. But you are such a modest person that at that time, I didn't even realize how many things you have accomplished and how broad is your professional brief. And I was really astonished when I was preparing this brief presentation or introduction of your webinar, how many things I discovered about you. And therefore, when I was preparing my information about you, I called it brief because it is really a brief. If when I went to your LinkedIn profile, there was so many things that you have completed, and such a variety of activities, such a variety of professional knowledge and skills that I was really astonished. So very briefly, Willow is English language fellow. She is now spending time in Poland at University of Rzeszów. I wish it were Kraków. She's at the US Department of State in the section of English language programs in San Jose, California. And she concentrates on the whole variety of areas. And here I would like to enumerate just four of them: staff development, educational leadership, teacher training, and teaching. And just a few words about your experience. I highlighted just a few places because there was so much of it. So I would like to start by saying that you were in South Korea. You were educating adult people there. You were in Japan also a few times, as I noticed. Of course, many areas that you covered in California. Apart from teaching English, you also teach Spanish, and that is really interesting to combine these two areas. Okay, and also I would like to say that as far as your educational background is concerned, you are a professional who can teach Spanish, and this is in the area of advanced Spanish. You are also knowledgeable in the area of Spanish language and culture, and you have a certificate in Latin American studies. And last but not least, volunteer experience, and that is really impressive. And the last thing that I would like to mention is the whole checklist of endorsements that I found on your LinkedIn profile. So you've been endorsed for curriculum design, adult education, lesson planning, higher education, literacy, educational technology, interpersonal skills, tutoring, classroom procedures, teacher training, staff development, educational leadership, and teaching English as a second language, not to mention Spanish. So I was really impressed, and I'm really grateful that you have accepted our invitation to have this webinar for us. My hope is that maybe when you stay here, there will be an opportunity to meet you at least once more at a webinar for IATF Poland. So welcome, and everybody, participants, enjoy the webinar.
Well, thank you so much, Lucina. That was a really wonderful introduction. I did want to point out that I see that someone in the chat box is saying they can hear me, but nobody else. So maybe someone needs to check. I think David Briseno said he can't hear anyone. So we might need to check the volume or something. But I'll just continue and say that that's a really wonderful endorsement. I think that a lot of people in the English language teaching field or language field have also worked in many different countries and in different contexts. I will make one small correction. I have taught beginning level Spanish, not advanced level Spanish. That's my dream one day, if I finally reach that level of Spanish. And yes, I met Lucina in Gdansk, and I'm so impressed by her energy and the energy of all the professionals I met in Gdansk. I have met so many wonderful Polish teachers here who are so experienced and have such a wide variety of knowledge. So I'm really humbled to be able to be here today. Let's see. And Lucina, would you like me to go ahead with my presentation then, or are we waiting to say hello to someone else?
Okay.
Okay. So today, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to the webinar. This is a new format for me because I usually do in-person workshops, and I like to have things be very interactive. So this is a different format for me, so we'll see. And the presentation will be on focusing on critical thinking, teaching students to identify and avoid common logical fallacies. And as Lucina said, I'm the English Language Fellow. And I'm from the States. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I've spent most of my adult life, when I haven't been overseas, in California. And I did study Spanish in TESOL, and I've taught in several countries, as well as studying in Latin America. And I'm very happy to be at the University of Rzeszów in the southeast of Poland. It's about an hour or so from Krakow, so I'm able to go there quite a bit. And my fellowship has been fantastic. I'm working with a wonderful group of people here. So in today's workshop, what I'm going to do is I'm going to define and give examples of several common logical fallacies. We don't have time to cover all of them today. There's a long list. And I will introduce activities you can use to teach students to recognize logical fallacies, and I will share more teaching resources. And after this workshop, it is my hope that you will be able to use or adapt the logical fallacy, either the activity ideas or some of the resources that I share with you, in your own context or in your future context if we have some future teachers here. And for the agenda, I wanted to talk first about why we should teach logical fallacies, some common logical fallacies. I will give definition and examples of each, and I will share some activities with which your students can practice identifying logical fallacies. I will share resources and links, and we'll have some time for questions. So first, why should we teach logical fallacies? And I think if we go back to the 4 C's, which I think many people are familiar with internationally, the 4 C's are critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. These are skills which have been highlighted as being essential skills for students in the 21st century. And of course, logical fallacies are very closely related to the skill of critical thinking. And if we look at a definition of critical thinking can be defined as the analysis and evaluation of facts to form a judgment. Now, that can be very difficult to teach our students because there's so much information and misinformation out there that our students are exposed to, especially online. And if we define what a logical fallacy is, it is an error in reasoning or poor logic, and that can obscure facts. So if we teach our students how to identify specific logical fallacies, we are able to help them develop that critical thinking skill of analyzing and evaluating facts. And I did want to say something first, which is that sometimes I hear people say that our students can't do critical thinking and that we need to teach our students to think critically. And I think that that we all know how to think critically, even young children. If you ask a young child where they would like to eat, they're able to examine the facts. This place has this sort of food, this place has this sort of food, and they're able to weigh those facts and make a judgment. So that's critical thinking. But what we're going to be talking about is more how to develop critical thinking skills for an academic context in a specific way. And another reason why I think that logical fallacies can be a great starting point is because, as I was reading online, the European Commission was saying that as teachers, we all agree that we want our students to have good critical thinking skills, but we often don't know what that means. How do we teach that? Because critical thinking is such a huge field. So I think that by narrowing it down to focusing on some specific logical fallacies, we know that we're helping develop academic critical thinking skills, and we have some sort of area that we can focus on. Makes it a little bit more, a little less challenging for us as teachers. And some reasons why we could teach logical fallacies is that we can help students to evaluate arguments and to make stronger cases in debates. So if you have students doing speaking activities, they're able to learn to identify fallacies and hopefully avoid them in their own speaking. And also when it comes to writing, we can help students strengthen their persuasive writing skills by not jumping to unrelated topics or drawing conclusions without evidence, as I know that we often see in our students' writing. And I mean, both of those, both writing and speaking skills can be helped by that ability to recognize when a topic is not related or an unfounded conclusion has been drawn. And we can also help our students become savvier consumers because they need to be able to judge the credibility of marketing messages, which they are constantly exposed to. And also we can help them evaluate arguments from the news, online, and help them develop media literacy skills, which is so important today. And before I go on, I wanted to say too that I think sometimes there's an idea that in order to teach English, we have to only be teaching specific grammar or specific vocabulary skills, and that's what teaching English is. Or if we're teaching academic writing, then that is teaching English. But I wanted to say too that anytime that we're doing anything content-based in English, anything that might interest the students in which the input is English, that also could be considered teaching English. So even if you're teaching another class or you're not teaching a class focused on academic writing or public speaking, you could possibly use some of these ideas maybe as an icebreaker at the beginning of class or maybe as a short activity at the end of class in order to teach these skills. It doesn't need to be an entire class devoted to the teaching of critical thinking or teaching of logical fallacies. And moving on, we come to our first logical fallacy, which is called the slippery slope fallacy. And depending on the level of students you're teaching, you might need to actually literally define the slippery slope, what slippery slope means. Slope, as you can see in the graphic, slope is an image, could tell, remind students of a ski slope. And slippery is, a surface that is not stable or on which you could slip or fall. And this slippery slope fallacy is when someone claims that one event will lead to another event and so on until we arrive at a very dramatic conclusion. And this is usually stated in such a way as to say that if you do this first thing, which might seem innocuous or might seem small, it will inevitably lead to this very shocking and very upsetting conclusion. So for example, and I have some examples from the United States because I was told by some teachers that they'd like to avoid talking about politics in their own countries. And I think that sometimes it's easier to teach these things to students if it's maybe more of a foreign example to them, so that we're not necessarily bringing up logical fallacies that they might hear in their own communities, or we might not be challenging a belief that someone they know and respect has. So that's, of course, your own judgment call. But I find when first introducing these, I try not to introduce topics to my students that I know they might be very resistant to. So, for example, an American example, if person A says, we need to enact gun control laws to fight gun violence, and then person B says, if we enact gun control laws, the next thing you know, we won't be allowed to have any guns at all. When that happens, we won't be able to defend ourselves against terrorist attacks. And when that happens, terrorists will take over the country. And actually, this is a fairly common argument that I hear sometimes. So, in essence, person A is talking about gun control laws, and person B is saying, if there are any gun control laws, terrorists will take over the country. If you take out the results in between, the initial conditional and the final result. So that's a slippery slope fallacy. And I found some social media examples. And again, this would depend on your context and your students' ages, and what you think are examples maybe that you've heard in your own classroom that you'd like to address. But for these examples, I did not cover the username of the first woman because she's actually a public figure in the United States. She's in Congress. And she said on Twitter, we can't dismantle institutional racism without first overhauling our critical justice system. The People's Justice Guarantee is an incredible set of reforms that will restore voting rights and solitary confinement and expand restorative justice programs. So in essence, she's saying, let's do some criminal justice reform. And then one of the comments on Twitter was someone who said, a country without law and order, what could possibly go wrong? So this is obviously a slippery slope argument in which the person says, if there is reform to the criminal justice system, then we will have no law and order in the country. And one of the ways that, after having introduced a few examples to your students of slippery slope fallacies, you could have them review this by giving them a few examples like these and asking if they can identify, is it a slippery slope fallacy or not? Because depending on the level of your students and depending on how familiar they are with this, they might mistake any conditional statement as a slippery slope fallacy. So for example, if we were doing this as a face-to-face workshop, I would pass these out and we would discuss these, but you could use these with your students. So for example, if you don't clean your room, you're not going out tonight. Second one, if you fail the test, you're going to end up living on the street. Or if you give money to a homeless person, no one will ever want to work. And the fourth, if you don't study, you're not going to pass the test. So if anyone would like to respond in the chat box, which of these would you consider to be logical fallacies? Examples of the slippery slope logical fallacy. I see some people are typing. Okay. Yes, so a few people said 2 and 3. Yes. So 2, if you failed the test, and this might actually be something students have heard, right? If you failed the test, then you'll never graduate from school. If you don't graduate from school, you'll never get a job. If you never get a job, you'll end up living on the street. So this might even be something students have heard. That's definitely a slippery slope fallacy. And number 3, if you give money to a homeless person, no one will ever want to work. So if you give money to a homeless person, maybe other people will see you giving the person money. People will quit their job. Suddenly no one's working. So that also would be a slippery slope fallacy. And I think it's important to say to students too, when we're talking about most logical fallacies, we're not saying that the conclusions drawn are 100% false or they're completely impossible. We're just saying that they don't logically follow directly from the first step or from what was first stated. And then for the first and the fourth, the first one, if you don't clean your room, you're not going out tonight. You could argue that that's not a natural consequence, and maybe that's not a fair consequence to not cleaning your room, but it's not a logical fallacy because presumably it would be a parent who is saying this and they're just telling the student or the child what the consequence is for the action. So just a condition and a result. And for the fourth one, if you don't study, you're not going to pass the test. That's actually fairly reasonable. And that's where we would like our students to eventually be, in the sense that they can take a conditional and come up with a fairly reasonable or possible result. So an activity idea that you could use with your students is a sort of a take on, I think, an activity that most of us have used before, which is chain writing. It's sometimes also called exquisite corpse, although I'm not sure why. um, in which you give students a piece of paper, and you could either ask your students to come up with the condition statement, you know, if you give money to a homeless person or something that they've heard maybe, or you could supply your own condition statements, maybe based on things you've heard students say or you've heard in your community and you think you might need to address. And then the student would write the result and then pass it on to their partner, and maybe you could have 3 or 4 students do it together. For example, for this one, you could maybe on the top of the paper, you could have typed, if you give money to a homeless person, and then the first student would respond by writing a result. People will learn you can get money without working, and they would pass it on to their classmate, who would then write, if people learn they can get money without working, then people will quit their jobs. And the next classmate, if people quit their job, then the country's economy will be ruined. And then the final student in a group of 4 could say, if the country's economy is ruined, then we will all become poor. So basically the argument, the logical fallacy argument would be, if you give money to a homeless person, then we will all become poor. And if you do this activity, just it's important to tell the students that you want them to write something as far-fetched as possible. You want them to kind of practice and have fun with this idea of a slippery slope fallacy. I've done this in class with students of all ages, and they've come up with some really funny final results, and they had a great time doing it. Another thing that you can do with this is you can also have students use this with advertisements. For example, if you don't buy the latest iPhone, and then have them follow that to its conclusion. And I find that's really good with students that maybe students that are more high school or college age, who not that we aren't all susceptible to those messages, but they might truly feel that if they don't have the latest product, no one will talk to me, and then I will have no friends, and then I will die alone. So they're able to really relate to it, and it's also a good way to sort of bring up, to build a space for students to talk about some of these messages that they're receiving. So this could lend itself well to a unit on talking about advertising or media. Let's see. And I'm not really paying attention to the time, so I'm hoping, Lucina, that you'll tell me if I'm approaching the end of the time. So because we don't want students to just recognize these fallacies, we also want them to learn how to not use them and to avoid them. An extension activity for the previous, for the chain writing, would be then to collect those stories and pass the stories to different groups of students. And those students would deconstruct the argument. So for example, going back to this example, if this were an example written by a group of 4 students, another group of 4 students could take it, and then you could give them in the instructions to take the first condition, if you give money to a homeless person, and come and brainstorm as many reasonable or logical very next steps they could think of. So I think I have an example here. So if for example, if the chain started with, if you don't use social media. And so when the students get their story, maybe the story said, if you don't use social media, you'll have no friends, you don't know what your friend's doing, you won't be popular, you'll never get married, something like that. So the students who have this story now that their friends have written, they will look at the first condition, if you don't use social media, and they will brainstorm as many reasonable results as they can. You might tell them to come up with 10 alternative results, and they might come up with these. You can text your friends, to keep in contact rather than using social media. You can have more privacy. You can share your photos in an email. You will have more time for other activities, and you might not be up to date with your friends' news. So these could be both positive or negative results to this condition, but you're giving students a chance to really think about what's reasonable and what's not over dramatic or sensationalistic as far as the next step goes. And I've done this before with students, and they have really enjoyed this activity. The second logical fallacy, I have a video clip here, but I don't actually, I may not be able to play it. I will give this source at the end of the PowerPoint. This is from an organization that has done about 6 different videos illustrating different logical fallacies. And the graphics are quite lovely, and they really lay out the logical fallacy. So I will just explain to you that in this video clip, which I can't play right now, they're talking about a sports expression that is, you should play the ball and don't play the player. And they were saying that if you that's in a logical fallacy in which you're attacking the person instead of attacking the argument, is quite common, because we often want to disbelieve someone who we dislike. So if we dislike someone, we might suspect their logic. Whereas if we like or admire someone, we might think that their logic is flawless, and that might not be the case. So this would also be called the ad hominem fallacy. And ad hominem means to the person in Latin. And this type of fallacy is sometimes, as I said, called name calling or a personal attack. It's quite common. And this occurs when someone attacks the person instead of attacking or responding to his or her argument. And for example, this person 1 says, I am for raising the minimum wage in our state. And person 2 says, she is for raising the minimum wage, but she is not smart enough to run a business. Now, at first glance, this actually might seem reasonable. This person 1 is talking about money, and the second person is pointing out that maybe this person has, actually my screen just changed. Let's see. Okay, 1 second. Let me get back to my slide. Okay. So this sounds like it might be reasonable because you're talking about money, and if person 1 actually couldn't run a business, it might seem reasonable to say that this person would not be an expert when it comes to talking about the wage. But actually, even though that may be true, it might mean that the person is less credible, but it doesn't mean that their argument is flawed. The idea of raising the minimum wage in the state could still be a great and a valid argument. And that's what the person should respond to. For those of you following in the last presidential election in the state, there was a lot said about Hillary Clinton's emails, and a lot of people responded and said, well, other people used emails in that way too, which seemed a convincing argument. But again, that's actually, kind of deflecting from that argument, attacking other people and not really responding to that. Okay, let's see. So for some social media examples, on Twitter again, the New York Times posted an article about hostile architecture, as they call it. And they said that hostile design has flourished in New York and other cities as a way to maintain order and ensure public safety, but critics say it's inhumane and targets the homeless. And in response to what the critics said, someone tweeted, well, those critics are morons or homeless. So this is obviously a personal attack against the critics, and this person is not at all responding to the argument, which is this hostile design? Is this okay? It's not okay. And instead they're attacking the critics. Now, ad hominem attacks aren't always that blatant. It's not always calling someone a name. One really common sort of ad hominem fallacy, and actually there are many subtypes of ad hominem fallacies, but I'm just covering the general umbrella today. If someone makes an argument online, we see this all the time, someone makes an argument and then someone responds just by correcting their spelling. And so in that way, they're saying, if you can't spell, your argument is invalid. Learn how to spell, and then we'll talk. So that is an attack on the person's intelligence in a way. Same with grammar. Often online we see someone who commits a grammar error, and they might have been making a completely valid argument, but suddenly their grammar has been attacked, and it's as if their argument is invalid because their grammar isn't good. And another sort of ad hominem attack would be not necessarily an insult, but pointing out if someone's behavior doesn't conform to age or gender or race, any sort of stereotype, and as a way of saying, well, this person's not normal, this person's not like others, so we shouldn't listen to them. And this isn't the best example of it, but this tweet about Greta Thunberg, who I'm sure we all have heard of, says the person says, people are getting fed up with your diatribes, Greta. You'd be better off offering real scientific evidence that proves there is a climate crisis, as this will prove impossible. Shut up. So by pointing out that Greta, kind of has these angry rants, this person is sort of deflecting and kind of attacking Greta for her behavior. And online, I've read many times people making mention of her anger and her angry expression, her angry face. And in a way, there's this idea that she's not acting as a teenage girl should act. A teenage girl should be friendly and, warm and pleasant. And so rather than attacking her argument, they're actually attacking her behavior or her expression in that case. And the third fallacy, I'm sorry, not the third one. For an activity idea for this, for ad hominem attacks, these are so common that your students can find them anywhere and everywhere, not just on social media. If they're doing research online, especially if they ever watch YouTube or look at comments on any online site, and if they're of the age where you're comfortable giving them an assignment to look for things online, you could have students look for these in the wild and maybe draw attention to the more subtle ones of making fun of someone's spelling, making fun of someone's grammar. And maybe for a few minutes in the beginning of class, students could share what they found and students could identify what the ad hominem attack is in the argument and what the actual argument, the original argument is that was not addressed. And for logical fallacy 3, this is the red herring fallacy. And the literal definition, a red herring is a fish. And I don't know if it's still used this way because I don't know much about hunting, but apparently a red herring is a quite smelly fish that was used to train hunting dogs. And so it was a very strong smelling fish, and the dogs would sometimes get distracted by the smell of this fish and not smell the animal that they were supposed to be hunting. Okay, I'm reading a good comment now. Okay, yes, someone mentioned Fox News and absolutely in academic literature too. Sorry. I'll come back to that. So as far as the red herring fallacy, this is any time in which you want to distract someone. And you could argue that all logical fallacies are a distraction. But in the case of the red herring, it's a very obvious and deliberate distraction to lead away from the topic. Let's see. So for example, this is actually the one that I was talking before about with Hillary Clinton. So for example, person A, the senator needs to account for the irregularities in his expenses. Person B, but other senators have done far worse things. So this may be absolutely true, and it does sound like it relates, but the person is making a point that the senator has done something they should account for. That's the argument that should be responded to. And in bringing in someone else, it almost sounds like a child, tattling on their sibling, saying, she did it too, or he did it too, mom. So it's a way of distracting. It's not always quite that obvious. Here's an example, another example from the States. This is from Twitter. Oh no, this is a Facebook comment. Someone said, there are too many shootings and we need to change the gun laws. And then someone said, as far as Australia, people using knives to kill have risen, or other methods. It's not a gun issue, it's a mental issue. So the topic is, what can we do? Let's change gun laws to address these shootings. And then the red herring is talking about Australia, talking about knives, talking about mental health issues. So that's actually multiple red herrings within one response, which is also a quite common thing to hear. Another way that you can talk to your students about these logical fallacies is you could have them kind of do a mock debate. So for example, you could have students in pairs and give them this list and tell them that they need to discuss these topics one person would read the topic and maybe start to talk about it, and the other person has to slip in a red herring to distract from the topic. So, for example, the first one, there are homeless people in our town. The town should provide free shelter for them. Number two, there are starving children in South Sudan. We should do something to help them. Number three, there's too much traffic congestion in this town. We need to spend more money on public transportation. And someone pointed out to me that sometimes students are too shy. They might not feel comfortable verbally debating these. So this is also something you could introduce as a writing exercise. Maybe have, if you're practicing note taking, maybe have students write a few notes that they might say in response to this that you can then review. But I've done this before as a verbal debate, and it's worked quite well. Students were able to come up with a lot of red herrings, especially ones that they themselves have heard. So I wonder, could anyone in the chat box give a red herring for one of these three arguments, maybe something that you've heard before or something that you think might be a possible red herring? See, somebody's typing. Yeah, there are plenty of homes elsewhere for number one. That's true. Mm-hmm. Like they could move. That's homeless want to be homeless. Mm-hmm. It could be a good red herring. Mm-hmm. Yes, for number two, people are hungry at home too. Why would we help the children in South Sudan when we have hungry children in our country? Mm-hmm. Yes. There are starving children in our town and nobody talks about them. Yes. Mm-hmm. There are other things to spend money on for three. Yes. Deflecting, to another argument. We don't need to spend money on that. We should spend money on something else. There are more poor people. The town should think about helping them. So coming up with different things that you could spend money on. Mm-hmm. Good. Why do people need to use cars? Walk. True. People shouldn't even be using cars. They should be walking. Yeah. I love your passion, Olga. That's true. Who will think about the homeless, starving dogs? Yes, that's true. Very good. And I'm kind of laughing at some of these, but again, just because something's a logical fallacy doesn't mean it's a valid argument or a valid point or a fact. It is true. I often hear regarding number two, well, there are starving children in our country, and that is true. But it's just that in the case of this particular argument, it's being used as a deflection or a distraction. Actually, someone told me that a politician had been asked about traffic congestion, and then they said, well, if people wouldn't sit so long at the red light once the light had changed, then we wouldn't have traffic congestion. Which I thought was a very creative red herring. Okay, very good. Let's see. So moving on to this. So, as far as some activities that you could use to practice all of the logical fallacies, unfortunately, I'm not able to share the video clips here just because I don't have, because of copyright issues, but I do have in my sources some clips that you can go to. One idea is to show video clips and have students identify the fallacy. So again, if you're comfortable introducing some sort of political debates in your class, political debates are always a fantastic source of logical fallacies, because it's not always possible for politicians to say everything they want to say in the time they have. They might, talk over each other, deflect so they can talk about what they want to talk about. And of course, if you do that, if you're able to find clips from both sides to share, In looking for some clips, I did find one from when Obama was president of the United States, and someone questioned him on a show and said, "Oh, Sarah Palin said something about his foreign policy," and instead of responding to the actual topic, he just said, "Well, Sarah Palin's not an expert on foreign policy," which that may be true, but it still was a way of deflecting from the question. So everyone commits logical fallacies, and I'd say your students, as you start to focus on these in class, your students will notice when you use them. So that's one caveat about using them. So you're going to have the video clips to identify the fallacy. There's a series of clips from the Simpsons TV series, and I believe that each clip opens with the name of the logical fallacy, but if you just cut that part off and show the clip and ask students to identify the logical fallacies, that's another way of practicing. Also, if you could have students raise their hand every time they hear a specific fallacy, you could give them a checklist with list of different fallacies, and they just check off each time they hear a specific fallacy. Another one is to have an illogical debate. Again, if you have students that like to talk and that aren't so shy, for them to either write down a conversation first or to practice in front of class and have their peers recognize which arguments they're using that are logical fallacies. So in that case, the students would purposely insert logical fallacies into their debate or their arguments. And there's another one that is create your own comics, which I'll show you in a minute. And another one that is the Foursquare activity, which I'll show you. Let's see. So this website, which I'll share with you at the end, has blank comic templates, and you can choose as many of the frames that you'd like. And then down below, there are pre-made characters that you can choose from to create your own comic strip. There are speech bubbles, and you can move the characters around. And this could be a way that you could have students demonstrate that they know what a specific logical fallacy is. To give an example of after you've taught them for a few days about red herring, maybe they create a comic about it. For my example, I named it a red herring, but you could have your students not name it, and then their peers have to identify the logical fallacy. And for mine, I had the character talking about, cars and cars being bad for the environment. And then someone starts talking about, but what about the car industry and people working for the car industry? If we, reduce cars, they will lose their jobs, which again, that is a valid point, but it's not really a good response to that argument. It's a deflection. It's a red herring fallacy. So this is something that also could work for younger students if you don't want them to be using maybe social media for class assignments, or you don't want to talk about politics. They could come up with all sorts of stories and comics using the characters on this page. And then the Foursquare activity is a very familiar graphic organizer. You could, when you finished teaching a certain logical fallacy or a group of logical fallacies, you could either have, as an assessment, have one student write, the logical fallacy name, a definition, a written example, as like some of the examples I shared with person A and person B, and then maybe a visual example from a comic or from social media, and then a video example that they could find. And when you go to YouTube and you just, Google or search like, slippery slope, red herring, there's so many videos that come up, so they could easily find something. Or you could do this as a group activity, and one student, finds the written example, one the visual, one the video, and they present it together. Or again, not put the name of the fallacy in the middle. Other students have to guess which fallacy it is. So just to do a little practice with these, I have a few more examples here. And if you could just tell me which logical fallacy that this is. The first one, again, about gun control. These are easy to find in states. Person A says, we need better gun control laws. And person B says, these shootings can be averted. Stop spending so much on wars. Bring our troops home and let's take care of our neighborhoods and schools. And I see that Michael Birch already responded that this is a red herring logical fallacy. Yes. This is something that we hear very often, and it almost sounds kind of reasonable. You know, this person is giving maybe some solutions, but really it's a deflecting from the main argument. Okay, for the next one, this is a long one. This was on a few comments I found on a website, and one person says, "It bothers me you have developed such a nice logical piece of media and load it with a reinforcing fallacy like global warming, and since the connotation is that there is warming is false and has been shown to be so by all the evidence for over the last 10 years from all sources, now that they have never been truly peer-reviewed and not based on the hockey stick camp's work. How do you justify this logically?" And then a person responds, "Logic. You may want to look up the definition of run-on sentence in your dictionary, then rephrase the question." So what sort of logical fallacy would that be in the response? Okay. Good. Yes. I see a few people have responded that it's an ad hominem. Yes, talking about grammar. So yes, the person's grammar is difficult it makes it difficult to read what they're saying. But rather than say, "Oh, could you rephrase that? I don't understand what you're saying," the person has basically said, you know, in essence, your grammar is bad, therefore your argument is bad. You have no logic. I will not engage. And that's quite common online. Okay. So I wanted to spend a little time, since this has been so, presentation centered or presenter centered. I wanted to give you a chance to share some of your ideas. I see that we have a really international group of participants here, and I would love to hear your ideas about, have you taught critical thinking before? And if so, how did you teach it? What were you focused on? Or have you taught logical fallacies? And do you have any ideas to share that have worked for you? And I think it would be helpful if you also state which group you work with. Are you working with university students, primary students? What's your context? And have you seen anything in this from these slides and these examples? I haven't shared all the sources yet, but from what you've seen so far, can you think of have you thought of any ideas or anything that you've seen that you could use or adapt for your context? Or has this given you any kind of ideas to think about what you could do in the future with your classes? So please, if you could type it in the chat box. Yes, Lucy, no, yes, we all need help with critical thinking, absolutely. Yes, yes. Um, So yes, speaking of the election in the UK, that also could be something that sure students are talking about or their parents are talking about. It'd be, a great time to start talking about some of those things. And does anyone else have anything to share about teaching critical thinking, what has worked for you, or if you could use any of these ideas in your context? And sorry if you can hear this noise. That seems the neighbor is drilling something right now. So sorry. Um, I see Michael's comment about using logic gates. I'm not sure what you mean. What do you mean? In terms of like teaching grammar for how to make a logical argument? Okay, great, David. Ah, okay. Hmm. Can you explain more what you mean, talking about using them for computing? Ah, okay, it's great. So great, Paulina. So you studied fallacies. Great. It is definitely a useful life skill for sure. And I see several people are typing now. Yes, Olga, I agree. And naming the fallacies can help them to organize thinking. And I mean, it depends on the age, right, that you're working with. No, and Michael, you're right. That I think that is often the case with logical fallacies, that they're being presented um, as an if and only if. Hmm. I'll have to do some more thinking about that. That's a good point. Oh, Olga, you're thinking too. Yes, yes. Of course, we can all we can all work on that. Hmm. Michael, I would say that I think fallacies are often presented as very black and white thinking, more of a if this happens, then this will happen, sort of like an absolute conclusion, which can be misleading. Hmm. So Aga's talking about discussions, asking students tricky questions. Yes, I've never taught an entire class on logical fallacies, but um, I think it can be something that's tied to culture also. If you bring in a few English language fallacies and show them to students, or a video clip for the first few minutes of class, that's a great way of starting class, getting students thinking in English, thinking about something cultural. I start all of my classes at the university with about a 10-minute activity that's related to culture. And I've done some of these as that kind of um, intro activity. It's not necessarily related to the central theme of the class, it's just something to share a cultural aspect with the students. Oh, great. Yeah, Aga, if your students are good at speaking, the students I teach now too, they love to talk. So having them debate these ideas or talk about possible alternatives could really work if you have talkative students. It's a little harder if they're quieter. Yes, and in fiction, also, Michael, I've used examples before from crime shows or crime movies or detective shows. There are a lot of red herrings. We've talked about examples where the camera will pan to one. Let's say, for example, we know that the perpetrator can speak French, and then there'll be a scene in which the camera pans to a character's bookshelf, and you see a few French novels. So that's a red herring that the director is trying to direct the viewer's attention to that fact. And so we draw the wrong conclusion. So definitely that works in TV shows and movies, and I'm sure also in fiction. There are a lot of great examples of that. Yeah, that would, I'm just thinking of like cases of mistaken identity or all sorts of consequences in plot that would arise from some kind of logical fallacy. That's a great idea. And then Lucina. Oh, great. So having the students use those in whatever project they're working on, their 21st century skills, that's great. And then, and Natalia, you said with debates, the students share different viewpoints and tend to respect other thoughts. That's great. And I think too, with logical fallacies, if you remind them that the viewpoints aren't necessarily wrong. They just might not follow from that argument. So if they're able to make the case in a different way, then that's fine. Yeah, great. Wonderful. So let's see, I think one more person's typing. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even as I'm reading them, it's easy to kind of laugh at the statements. So yeah, that's a really good point. Showing students how they can respond to someone's argument without just dismissing what the person's saying or turning it into like a personal attack. Absolutely. Let's see. Yes. And that's why I'm sharing examples because this is for teachers, but obviously some of these examples, especially related to politics or certain viewpoints, you know your students, you know what you could share in class and can't share. And that's also a great way to kind of be helping students modify their own responses if they don't agree with something or they don't agree with someone's belief, for sure, for sure. Let's see. Um, Can anyone red herring my spelling mistake made before just for fun? We could say, let's see, where's Olga? You said you made a spelling mistake. Let me see. Oh, you said you wanted to say use. Okay, so you spelled use, Y-O-U-S-E. Um, yeah, that's how would you respond if someone had a spelling mistake? How could you respond to that? Olga, if you could type better, perhaps I would listen to you. I think the most crushing one though is if someone would just, let's say someone would just type, let's see, can I type? Just that response. So not even paying attention to your argument whatsoever, just a kind of scathing correction to say, you're dismissed, you've had your spelling corrected. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's good for us to think of that as teachers as when we're correcting our students' papers too. Let's see. Yeah. Yeah. I actually was raised in a town where people used the word use as a plural for you. So yeah, it's interesting. So I wanted to share some. You're welcome, Olga. I wanted to share some of the sources and resources that you could use. Clearerthinking.org has a fantastic array of quizzes and mini courses. They talk about political bias. I think actually this might be the site where students can take the quiz to kind of see where they would lie politically. Concordia University from Portland has some really great classroom resources. And European Commission talked a little bit about the four C's, in case anyone's not familiar with the four C's. And the Excelsior College Online Writing Lab, this one has a lot of examples for writing. Thanks, Lucina. Excelsior College Online Writing Lab has a lot of resources for writing, academic writing. Information is beautiful is if you want to really have some very nice graphics. Aesthetics are important when you're presenting things, and that has some great examples. And then in the States, the NEA talks about the four C's also, if you want to see the US kind of take on that. And the guide they have to the four C's in 21st century learning has a really great source list. And they even talk about the theoretical framework, because I come from an adult education and university background. So the four C's are something that I wasn't so familiar with, and I found a lot of helpful information on that. And the Purdue University Online Writing Lab, for anyone who teaches academic writing in English, this is a fantastic resource. University students are always referred to this, and they have great rules. They really break it down. They scaffold all the information quite well. Rational Wiki has a really long list of fallacies, and they talk about formal logical fallacies, and these are the more informal logical fallacies. And the video that I couldn't show you, but trust me when I say it was a very aesthetically pleasing video, is from Tech and You Vids on YouTube. They have a series of videos. And Your Logical Fallacy also is another site that lists a lot of different fallacies and illustrates them. And then the last link is the YouTube one that shows a series of videos with logical fallacies from the Simpsons, which I highly recommend if you have students that are of the age that they could enjoy the Simpsons. They're really great. Yeah, and Rob said OWL is great. Yeah, absolutely. OWL, Purdue OWL is so often used. You're welcome, Irina and Monica and Paulina. So, dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much. If you would like this PowerPoint, I can email it to you. You can just email me at willowbarnowski.elfellowinpoland@gmail.com. And if you want any information about the program, the fellowship that I'm on, here is some more information about that. You can check out those sites. Oh yes, Lucina says Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Yes, if anyone's leaving, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And thank you so much for attending this webinar and for participating. And it was absolutely a fantastic experience for me to hear your ideas. Yes, my email, let's see. Thank you, thank you. Happy holidays. Hope to see all of you at an IATEFL Poland event in the future. Yes, yes, I'd love to. I'd love to do another webinar. Merry Christmas, Katarzyna. Merry Christmas, Alina. Thank you, Natalia and Michael. Thank you very much for your comments. Merry Christmas, Renata. Bye, Aga. Merry Christmas. Thank you. Thank you so much. Ah, a ti también. Thank you. Feliz Navidad.